In January of 2005, a game was released that would forever change what horror meant in video games. Resident Evil 4 didn't just redefine a franchise that was already struggling to stay relevant. It rewrote the rules for an entire genre and influenced nearly every action game that came after it. But here's the thing that most people don't realize. The game we got was almost nothing like what Capcom originally planned, and the journey to get there was filled with failed experiments, desperate gambles, and one director's obsession with making something completely different from what anyone expected. Before we talk about what Resident Evil 4 became, we need to understand what Resident Evil was dying from. By 2003, the series was suffocating under its own legacy. The original trilogy had terrified players with tank controls, fixed camera angles, and limited resources. You moved like a tank, the camera forced you into uncomfortable positions, and every bullet mattered. This worked perfectly in 1996 when the first game came out, but by the early 2000s, gaming had evolved. Players had experienced smoother controls in action games. They had seen what dynamic cameras could do. The old Resident Evil formula suddenly felt outdated, clunky, and frankly boring to a new generation of gamers. Resident Evil Zero released in 2002 and used the same old mechanics. Critics praised the graphics but complained about everything else. Sales were decent, but nothing spectacular. Capcom had a serious problem on their hands. Their flagship horror franchise was becoming irrelevant. This is where Shinji Mikami enters the story with a mission that seemed impossible. Mikami had directed the original Resident Evil, so he understood the DNA of the series better than anyone. But he also saw the writing on the wall. Horror games needed to change or they would die. Capcom gave him the task of creating Resident Evil 4, and what happened next became one of the most chaotic development cycles in gaming history. The first version of Resident Evil 4 was so different from the final game that Capcom eventually turned it into an entirely separate franchise. You might know it as Devil May Cry. That's right, the stylish action game about Dante fighting demons started as a Resident Evil game. Mikami and his team were experimenting with superhuman abilities and over-the-top action, but they quickly realized this wasn't Resident Evil anymore, so they scrapped it and started over. Then they tried again with a supernatural horror approach, featuring a version of Leon Kennedy infected with a parasite that gave him special powers. This version got pretty far into development before Mikami killed it too. He wasn't satisfied. Nothing felt right. After multiple failed attempts and years of wasted work, the pressure on Mikami was crushing. He made a public statement that if Resident Evil 4 wasn't the best game in the series, he would quit working on the franchise forever. The final version of Resident Evil 4 that Mikami eventually settled on threw out almost everything that defined Resident Evil. Gone were the fixed camera angles that had been a staple since the beginning, gone were the shambling zombies, gone was the focus on puzzle solving and creepy mansions. Instead, players got an over-the-shoulder camera that put them directly behind Leon Kennedy's shoulder. This single change transformed everything. You could finally see what you were aiming at. Combat became precise instead of clumsy. Movement felt modern and responsive. But Mikami made sure this wasn't just another action game. He replaced zombies with something far more terrifying. The Ganados weren't mindless creatures stumbling towards you. They were infected villagers who could think, coordinate, and adopt. They would flank you, call for help, and use weapons. When you entered a village early in the game and the church bell rang, dozens of them surrounded you from all directions. This wasn't survival horror in the old sense. This was something new entirely. What made Resident Evil 4 revolutionary was how it balanced action and horror without losing either. Previous Resident Evil games made you feel helpless by limiting your options. Resident Evil 4 gave you more tools, better controls, and dynamic combat, but it still made you feel constantly threatened. Resources were limited enough that you couldn't just spray bullets everywhere. Enemies were aggressive enough that even with good aim, you could get overwhelmed. The game introduced the attaché case inventory system that turned managing your limited space into a mini puzzle every time you picked something up. You had to decide what to keep and what to sell. Every healing item, every grenade, every weapon upgrade mattered. This created tension not through clunky controls, but through meaningful choices. The influence of Resident Evil 4 on the gaming industry cannot be overstated. The over-the-shoulder camera became standard in almost every third-person action game after 2005. Gears of War, Uncharted, Dead Space, The Last of Us, and countless others all borrowed directly from what Resident Evil 4 established. The active reload system in Gears of War took inspiration from Resident Evil 4's emphasis on precision and timing. Dead Space was essentially Resident Evil 4 in space, using the same camera perspective and similar pacing. Even games outside of the horror genre started using similar design principles. Resident Evil 4 proved that you could make controls feel good and still maintain tension and fear. But what about the Resident Evil series itself? Did Resident Evil 4 save the franchise or damage it? This question still sparks debates among fans today. On one hand, Resident Evil 4 was a massive commercial and critical success. It saved Capcom from a franchise in decline and brought in millions of new fans. On the other hand, it moved the series away from pure survival horror towards action. Resident Evil 5 and 6 followed this trend and went even further into action territory. Many longtime fans felt betrayed. They wanted the slow burn dread of exploring dark hallways with limited resources, not shooting hundreds of enemies in broad daylight. It wasn't until Resident Evil 7 in 2017 that Capcom would return to the series' horror roots, using first-person perspective and a focus on atmosphere over action. The 2023 remake of Resident Evil 4 is fascinating because it shows how much gaming has evolved since 2005. The remake maintains the core design of the original but refines nearly everything. Movement is smoother, combat is more dynamic, and the story gets deeper character development. Yet it still feels like Resident Evil 4 because the foundation Mikami built was that strong. So why does Resident Evil 4 matter today, more than 20 years after its original release? Because it represents a perfect moment when a single developer took a massive risk that could have destroyed everything and instead created something that changed gaming forever. Shinji Mikami could have played it safe. He could have made another game with fixed cameras and tank controls that would have satisfied hardcore fans but alienated everyone else. Instead, he burned everything down and rebuilt from scratch multiple times until he created something that felt fresh, modern, and still true to what made Resident Evil special. The game proved that evolution doesn't mean abandoning your identity. You can modernize while keeping the core of what makes something work. That lesson influenced not just horror games, but the entire industry's approach to updating classic franchises. Resident Evil 4 defined horror by understanding that fear doesn't come from clunky controls or artificial limitations. Real fear comes from meaningful stakes, smart design, and constant pressure. It respected players enough to give them good tools, then designed challenges that pushed those tools to their limits. That's why it still holds up today, and that's why its influence can be seen in dozens of games across multiple genres. When a single game can change how an entire industry thinks about design, that's when you know something truly special happened. If you enjoyed learning about how Resident Evil 4 changed gaming forever, make sure to hit that subscribe button for more deep dives into gaming history. Drop a like if this video taught you something new, and let me know in the comments what game you think had the biggest impact on the industry. Share this with any gamer who loves Resident Evil or wants to understand how modern action games were shaped.